So this is Monday, the 14th of October, and we're doing an oral history with the Crush Steering Committee. My name is Dane, Elliot. I'll be one of the interviewers.
I'm Rosemary, Remacle, and I will be the other interviewer.
I'm Regis McKenna. I was the president of Regis McKenna, Inc. We did the advertising and public relations for Intel from 1981, and I was invited to join the original Crush group when it was formed in 1979.
I'm Rich Bader. I was a product manager for the single board computer group, the multibus group, and got to be their representative in the Crush Steering Committee.
I'm Jeff Katz. I was the product manager for the 8086, and therefore the main culprit, whose product line hadn't, also the main beneficiary, whose product line had suddenly gotten a lot of competition. As part of the steering committee that set it up, I also devolved into the chief bureaucrat to operate all the 9 programs and coordinate all the program leaders.
I'm Dave House, and in '76 I became marketing manager for microprocessor and peripheral components, working for Bill Davidow and then later for Les Vedez. And in 1978 I became general manager for that division, in charge of microprocessors and peripheral components and embedded controllers product line. So I got enlisted very early when the corporation launched the campaign.
And I'm Bill Davidow, and at the time of Crush, I was running the microcomputer systems division, and I was the member of the executive staff meeting who got tagged with running the program.
Okay, first question, and this one really goes out, I think, mainly to Bill and David, but anybody else who has any comment should chime in. And that is, what was the market and competitive environment like, or perceived to be, by Intel before the initiation of Crush?
Maybe I could open with that. The 8080 was launched in May of 1974 and had been hugely successful. The 4004 and 8008 were not commercial successes. But the 8080 got into the MITS Altair, and Bill Gates is writing BASIC for it, and it starts becoming an important product. But the 8085 really took second seat to the Z80 from Zilog. And we were having problems relative to that. 8086 wound up being our answer. And what we found by this time, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, was that Motorola had the 68000 and Zilog had the Z8000, and we were commonly coming in third when it came to design win choices. Bill?
I remember thinking about the 8086 and how important it was, we thought, to have some level of software compatibility. Also, I had been running marketing for Hewlett-Packard before the computer division, before I came to Intel. And at Hewlett-Packard, when we introduced the first mini computers, they were the largest, slowest, heaviest, and most expensive mini computers with the worst architectures. And I thought, boy, I'm right back in the same situation again at Intel. So I perceived of a sort of malaise, and that we were sort of going to have to pick at the bones in order to get as many design wins as possible.
I'd like to add a little bit about that market situation at the beginning of the Crush period. For the couple of years prior to that, the 8086, for at least starting a couple of years prior to that, 8086 had been the first 16-bit microprocessor, and it got a lot of play in the press and a good number, we thought, of design wins, but not much business because 16-bit processors took a lot longer to develop than 8-bit ones did. I was under the gun as product manager for getting some revenue for a change.
And we were late on the peripheral components.
The peripherals weren't all ready. But finally, by 79 or so, we were doing okay with what we thought was a good set of design wins. But about that time, after a couple of years in the marketplace, the competition had a chance to do what they thought were better architectures, and the customers were buying that story. So the pressure got on me to do better with what I had.
Why were the architectures perceived to be better?
The critical thing was 64K segments, a 16-bit address versus a 32-bit address. The 68,000 had several things going for it. One was a 32-bit address space. The programmers loved that. It had a general purpose set of registers. It was sort of VAX-like, so it was familiar to them. Where we had been constrained in the 8086 architecture by two factors. One is the 8800, which later became the 432, was our official next generation product. The 8086 was really developed as a stopgap. And secondly, we had to be culturally compatible with the 8085. It wasn't binary compatible, and we advertised a translator program. I don't remember what we called it, to take source code or assembly code from the 8085, 8080, and convert it to binaries for the 8086. So the critical thing was that 64K segment, 16-bit address.
So any engineer who understood mini computer architecture was going to appreciate what Motorola and Zilog?
Exactly.
The software guys. I mean,
The software guys.
in the multi-bus business, we were actually building a very successful business using 8086-based boards. Much more successful, higher price points than what we'd seen in the 8-bit market. There wasn't the same level of board competition from either Motorola or Zilog. So if an engineer was looking for that level of system solution and they would dominate the design decision as opposed to the software guys, we were doing pretty well with design wins and volume production.
As I recall, in the beginning of '78, the development system business and board business was bigger than the component business. And certainly far more profitable, because the component business wasn't profitable.
But we're also not talking about a huge volume market.
No.
These were really the early days of the microprocessor.
Bill, you described a sense of malaise, I think you said, in the executive staff level. What was the feedback from the field, and what kind of, maybe you're not the right person to answer, it's somebody else at the table, but what was the process by which the factory gathered feedback from the field and decided what to do about it? What role did the field play in strategic planning or even tactical planning inside the factory?
Well, I think we were hearing field objections. I know we were hearing field objections, but you know, one of the jobs of marketing is to take what you've got and sell it. And there was not a lot that we could do. And then we got the famous 8-page telex from the field from Don Buckout that said the field is depressed. Everywhere you go, we're losing business. There's no way we can win with this product, and this is really going to be important for Intel, so you guys better get your act together.
So what was the reception in the ESM when you walked in there with that?
As I remember the process, I took the 8-page, I had the 8-page telex copied, and I handed it around in the ESM. And I announced that my business was dependent upon 8086 design wins. We weren't getting them, and the microprocessor guys were killing my business, that they were acting like a bunch of whipped dogs, and why didn't they go out there and do something about it and fight? And there was a little bit of a discussion after that, and Andy looked around the room and he said to me, "You solved the problem." And that was how Crush got started.
How did it get from that point to a formal, we're going to get a group of people together in a room, get the name, get the plan in place? I mean, what were the next steps after that ESM meeting?
Well, Intel was a very small, top-down managed company, and we could turn it on a dime. And I left that meeting thinking, well, my career is on the line here. And if the microprocessor system division fails, I don't have another job lined up. And I get excited about marketing kind of challenges. I had seen a similar type of marketing challenge at HP, and I realized that at that point, I remember going down to the Los Angeles sales office, and the guy who was there telling the people that worked to him that they all had to come into the sales office at the end of each day and tell one another about what they had done and how good it was going, and or positive things. And I thought, all right, that really worked in LA, so why don't we just try the same thing at Intel? And I then called a meeting, and we got started, and there were Dave was there, and Jim Lally was there, and Regis joined us, and we all sat around the table and said, what are we going to do? And we only had one option, and that was to sell at the system level, because we were worse at the component level. But we had all of these other things going, and I remember thinking to myself, if we can position ourselves around the fact that this is the most important technical decision a corporation will make for the next decade, we can talk to people at a very, very high level and talk to them about the amount of engineering time involved, how total system cost will be less because we'll have all these peripherals, how you'll be able to write your software faster.
Time to market.
Time to market, all these things.
Development costs.
And we had those discussions, and all of us were looking for advantages, and that's how Crush got started.
Who were
I
the
remember
steering-
them meeting Lally going to the blackboard or whiteboard or whatever it was, and writing down strengths and weaknesses and pulling ideas out of the group, and we kind of had a big idea exchange there, and out of there sort of came that realized that we were letting the competition set the rules of the game. We were letting them be about address space and register sets and about the architecture. And the decisions were being made by the software engineers increasingly and not the hardware engineers, and we were losing at that level. Yet we had the compilers and the debuggers and the in-circuit emulators, the blue box, the Intel development system. We had the board level products. Our peripherals, no matter what their state, was much better than Motorola and Zilog's peripherals. At least we had partially working chips. They just had data sheets with no parts at that point in time. And so we had even credibility in that part of the solution. So I really give credit to Bill and Jim to saying, well, we got to change the rules of the game here. We got to make this about the system level sell and the solution, and we need to sell up in the organization. We got to stop trying to win at the programmer level, and we need to win at the VP of engineering and the CEO level. And Bill, I remember saying, this is the most important decision our customer is going to make in the next decade. This is not a software engineer decision. This is a CEO decision, and we need to go tell the customers.
And Bill, you did write several articles on that subject, quite frankly, that really were addressed to the top management, and we started talking to the business
was part of the PR
media,
campaign
right, the
that
media,
you were-
right, about the benefits of essentially designing with a systems level
And
architecture.
the importance of the decision on your corporation.
Right.
Richie, both you and Jeff mentioned the steering committee. Between the two of you, can
I was about to fill in the gap between writing articles and executing
Yeah,
the program.
thank you.
And the original genesis. There was this week of intense meeting, which is about with 7 of us, the 5 here at this table, and Lally and
Casey Powell.
Casey
Casey Powell, that's right.
all around the table and in the conference rooms, mostly at Intel's then building number 6, which was the system headquarters, where we just threw all our ideas on the table and on the wall and discussed them and went home at night after 12 hours and did it and come back the next morning and do it all over again based on what we thought of while we were sleeping. It was a very intense program of idea creation, which culminated after a week with a presentation to the executive staff to say, here's what we think we need to do. And we had this program of 9 different sub-programs. And it was a lot of money, including some of the sub-programs were the most expensive advertising and travel campaigns that we'd ever done.
Ballpark number?
Ballpark number, I believe, was like $2 million on ads, and we'd never spent more than a couple $100,000. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes.
Was Don Buckout part of the steering committee?
He was not a part of the physical group, but he was on the phone.
But
as I
Casey
recall.
was Don's boss, wasn't he?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Don had some other reasons he couldn't be there at the meeting, and Casey came. I don't know if he just liked to be in California or if he really was Don's representative or boss or what.
Well, he was very urgent about the problem. He was very vocal about the contents of Don's telex.
So having done the executive staff sell, we got the nod. And they said, okay, go do it, we'll spend the money. And then we had to go back and have another series of meetings to prepare the rest of the company for it.
Because Christmas was coming. And we had a real sense of urgency that we had the holidays coming and people were going to be gone, and how are we going to get this ready and get this launched?
I had to cancel my ski trip between Christmas and New Year's to sit around the table with the same 7 folks architecting the program to be, or the presentation to kick it off to the rest of the company right after the first of the year.
How contentious or collaborative, those kind of two ends of the spectrum, were those meetings?
I remember them as incredibly collaborative.
Yes.
It was an amazing coming together of folks that knew each other, were acquaintances, but we'd never really done a lot of work together before.
Bill and Don Buckout and Casey Powell had convinced us that our life depended on it. This slide from that time, we can't remember what presentations, is crushed. The purpose, to establish a sense of urgency and to set in motion critical corporate-wide decisions and action plans to address a life-threatening competitive challenge. And that's, I think, what really brought us all together. We felt that our careers and our company were at stake here.
There was much more analysis in the meetings than fighting back and forth over what should or shouldn't be done. I think it was trying to understand the problem and understand what the strengths and weaknesses were of the competition, as well as what the strengths of Intel. How do we address our strengths versus their weaknesses, and what might we do in order to essentially present that?
So there
to
was
the market?
$2 million,
the
$2 million for, I'll come back, Bill, I'm sorry. There's $2 billion for ads, but there's a whole lot of other things that I heard you talk about. Where did the rest of the budget come from?
I don't remember how much budget there was, but we basically had pretty much a blank check.
Well, that's true. We could, whatever we said and attached the word crush to was able to be done. The biggest other expense was the sales incentive the design win incentive
And
program,
that was a little controversial.
where we had promised those sales folks who got their quota of design wins and were able to help their peers get their district's quota of design wins, would be offered a trip to an exotic location. And we thought of various exotic locations and finally ended up with Tahiti.
Very non-Intel at the time.
And we expected maybe as much as half of the sales force might get through it, and we figured out the budget for that, which would have been close to $1 million added. But it turned out that it was such a good incentive that like 98% of the sales force had to go to Tahiti, and none of the factory guys got to go because the budget was overspent, and that came out to be another close to $2 million.
I think one of the things that is critical is that Intel was a component company. They were making memories, and the semiconductor memory business was a component business. And people like Bill and Dave came in, and they were really brought the systems
We came out of
mentality.
computer companies.
You brought the systems
I
mentality.
did too.
Everybody here.
Yeah, that's
Didn't know
interesting.
your background,
All
but-
of us have computer
Right.
backgrounds. None of us were semiconductor
And that was,
physicist.
you know that you were sort of a fifth wheel
Yep.
for several years there. And then as you brought this systems mentality into it, all went into this meeting, because that was primarily.
And Bill
the
was
meeting.
critical,
Yeah.
and even
So
the early days of
So
getting
the
that.
thing I remember that still amazes me, and I suspect that Intel was a $500 million to $1 billion company at that time. I don't remember how
Yeah.
large it was. But everybody got on board. And, this was something that was done as a staff position. There was no line authority within the group. And the marketing managers from other divisions had to change their budgets or change their budgets to be supportive of the program. I remember Darby doing that. And then I remember that, Andy and Bob Noyce standing up in front of the company and saying, we are going to do this, we're committed to do this, and we support it. And I've never seen a situation in what was a large company where the whole company got turned, on a dime to do this. And I think that's one of the things that was amazing about Intel at that time, that it was so apolitical and that so many people were committed to the success of the company that somebody like an Andy could say, hey, let's all go this way. And everybody sacrificed their own little fiefdoms to support this effort. And that was something that made Intel very different.
And as I recall, it was the MBO process was used to take it down into the trenches.
Like everything at Intel.
Yeah.
Yeah, MBO drove one.
And in virtually every operation of the company.
And then there were regular weekly meetings in which
Yes.
you came in with your ARs.
Yep.
And God help you if you didn't get yours
You had to
done.
stand up in front of your peers
Right.
And expose yourself, whether you
Right.
got your
Every week
action
you were-
items done or
you-
not.
You know, and I think that process was just marvelous. It
So-
moved everything constantly forward.
As the chief bureaucrat, I called the weekly meetings for each of the 9 programs, and they were all, watching each other. And then a monthly meeting in front of the executive staff to say what we had accomplished that next month, that previous month. And in Andy's old book, it said, whatever you watch gets well. We watched it pretty closely, and it got well.
So I was recently in another interview, listening to another interview, and one of the individuals was asked what he did or was he part of Crush. And his answer was interesting. 32 years later, his answer was, everybody at Intel was part of Crush. Yeah. If you worked for Intel at that time, Crush was your only focus.
And I remember the DRAM guys and the EEPROM guys and the static RAM guys trying to be part of Crush. I mean, trying to figure out what their
and
role
even the
was.
memory system guys
Yeah,
who were.
yeah, the memory systems guys.
Right. I have a lot
Everybody.
of memory systems.
Right.
Yeah.
But of course, the EEPROM was very critical because it allowed programmers to change programs frequently in debugging and wound up becoming a production vehicle, actually. The static RAMs were used more with microprocessors than anything, but the DRAM guys were busy trying to figure out how they fit in. But everybody was part of it.
Can somebody talk about how Crush, the name how it got that name, and what the legal department's response and the field's response to it was?
Well, it was Jim Lally's idea, and it was based on the fact that the Denver Broncos had this very good, I don't know that it was, I think it was an offensive line, but it might have been the defensive line that was just tearing up the opponents. And Jim,
And they had orange uniforms.
They had orange uniforms, and Jim says, let's make it Crush. And that spread throughout the whole corporation.
That was also a popular soft drink.
Check Rich's,
Yeah. Crush.
Get to make sure. Wait.
Get the t-shirt. Tuck it in. Tuck it in.
Okay. And the official illegal shouldn't wear it in corporate headquarters shirt. And it was Orange Crush was the.
Terrified
Well,
the legal
the
staff.
team was called the Orange Crush. The front
Yeah.
line was called the Orange Crush. And so
Which
it
was a
became
play
Crush,
on words against the popular soft drink.
which was
Right.
Orange Crush.
Yeah.
And therefore, the Orange Crush,
Canned
Intel
crush.
8086 Crush, can crushing the 68000 and the Z8000.
But the Roger Borovoy then went crazy because he thought of the antitrust implications that we were trying to annihilate competition.
We thought that was a good idea, but
But
and
you
he was
guys-
chief legal counsel at the time. So the T-shirt got banned, and it still became the inside slang word was the Crush campaign, but we weren't able to
Of
call
course,
it
at that time, it was a bit presumptuous on their behalf, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, right. That we should at that time be
Right,
guilty of antitrust.
Right.
Well,
I think the observations about the system selling and the fact, I wasn't aware either that all of us had computer company background.
Of course, I was working with Apple at the same time.
Right. It's, the company that I have now, we've gone through similar transitions where we have a new package of services, the solutions are bigger, we have to upsell where we go in the organization to do that. Those are big changes in any organization, and the fact that Intel identified that that was the direction that it had to go, it wasn't just a chip company anymore, and could turn hundreds of folks into being effective solutions selling people in such a short period of time is, in hindsight, astounding.
well, if you think about it, I think Gordon Moore was CEO at the time. Gordon is the ultimate silicon technologist. Andy, of course, wrote the book on silicon technology. Our technology development group it still is the backbone of the company, always was the backbone of the company. Our wafer fab capabilities, our ability to actually produce this stuff and get decent yields and reasonable quality were what the company was known for. And we came out of Shockley Semiconductor, Fairchild Semiconductor. We were a semiconductor kind of company. And the microprocessor at that time was sort of an oddity. It was, Gordon would say you got to have the memory because otherwise you can never debug the process because you can't, it's a nice X by Y array and we can find the defects and we can study defect density and the microprocessor's random logic and so you can't really use that. And so we were sort of this sideline product. After Bill had joined the company, actually Ted Hoff started developing the first SIM boards, the first boards to demonstrate that the 8008 and 4004 and then the 8080 would do things. And that wound up evolving into the development system that Bill really drove that business in the very early days. And Jim Lally from a marketing standpoint and Bob Garrow from an engineering standpoint had built this little oddity on the company that was quite profitable. And as I said, it was bigger than the component business. And then we had this memory systems division over here that was sort of an appendage as well. But we were a silicon process, chemistry, physics, technology development, wafer fab kind of company. And that's why I think we naturally were sort of selling the microprocessor, and we were selling registers, and we were selling addressing, and we were selling chip size, and we were selling I/O buses, and we had our head into semiconductor things, and that's what we were selling.
Well,
and the Crush campaign just took that and turned it upside down.
Well, I remember, earlier years, whenever Mike Markella was product manager.
Oh, yes, I remember
of
that.
memory.
Yep.
That's what his job was. And he was telling me that we've got this new thing called the 8008 at the time that was going to sell a lot of memory.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of the microprocessor originally was it's going to sell a lot of memory.
When I
And
took
it
over,
Yeah.
when I took over
it still does.
microprocessors,
Eventually.
Yeah.
when I took over microprocessors in
Intel.
'78, the sales, the division got credit for the sale of the memories that went along with the microprocessor, and we came up with specially numbered components. So we had the 2104 was the 1K or something static DRAM or static RAM, but we had an 8104 which was the same chip, but that was what you used with a microprocessor.
Part of the kit.
And so it was a kit cell, and we had memory, and the whole story was, well, we test those differently. We have a different test program. They're optimized around the microprocessor. You can't use those other parts because they're not optimized around the microprocessor.
And they have all the second sources.
Yeah, they have all the second sources, but and so even then, we counted as part of microprocessor business, the memory business that went along with it, because our job at that point was to sell memories.
Well, it also, and I don't know if we're getting ahead of ourselves, but it was this transition because the Japanese had entered into the RAM business, were driving prices down, and I remember people were asking Intel, not should you stay in the business, but why are you in the business? Because the returns were so bad. And as a result, the company was transitioning. The microprocessor market had not really taken off yet. The memory business was declining very rapidly, and the move toward, and yet we were faced with competition from Motorola and TI on their processors.
So the company wasn't
or
that
Zilog,
strong at the
rather.
time, was it?
It was a very life and death struggle.
So let me follow up one item on the specially numbered components. It's my recollection, and I'm asking, didn't we get more dollars per unit for the specially marked
Oh, yeah,
components?
they had a higher price.
So they sold at a higher ASP than the standard component.
From a memory standpoint, it was really the 4K level that we lost that business to MOSTEC with a 16-pin chip versus our 22-pin 4K. And at the 16K, MOSTEC was losing it to the Japanese. And it was about this point in time when that business was under heavy attack. And we certainly were no longer the leaders in the DRAM, but we were in static RAMs and in EEPROMs. And the EEPROM business was just getting started. And so that really was a better integrated sale with the microprocessor at that point in time. So even the memory business was becoming more reliant on the microprocessor for that reason.
Back on
Windows.
back on
Ones with the
Crush
little
as opposed to
I still have
memories,
some of those.
which were key on this thing. Can anybody accurately say what they believe the strategic and tactical objectives we had for Crush were?
I'll take a shot at that. The strategic objective was to regain our leadership role in the perceived microprocessor marketplace.
And save our company.
And save our company in the process by being able to sell all the other stuff that the flagship microprocessor could drag along with it. I think we actually used the term drag business.
Yes.
Yes.
The tactical thing, which was really quite remarkable, was we put all of our former marketing hats on. We were all engineers, but we all had several years of marketing behind us. And we had some very creative folks like Lally and Mr. Bader here, who thought what we called think sideways.
Lateral thinking.
Lateral thinking.
Thank you. That's a nice way to put it.
I think that was Lally's term, in fact. We came up with some really good tactics. The 9 programs that I mentioned. I'll tick off a few of them. There was a major campaign to make all new literature that supported this system cell. Another campaign
And it
to
had to
make
look the same.
Yeah, they all looked the same. They all had appeared to be the same family.
The Crush golf ball.
We had the kind of a logo kind of thing too, but we also had a special book of only the future things that are coming out, and that was a prize to be given only to the seminar attendees. And the seminar program and the design win program, I think, were our 2 most brilliant tactics. The seminar program had 2 branches. One, we sent our executives out to do the high-level sell to our major customers' high-level executives, along with our engineers to talk to their engineers, and we did one-day seminars that way to poison their minds. And then we also had the second phase of seminars, which was a public, by invitation to all the rest of the customers. 2-day seminar sessions at all major marketplaces in the world. And this went on for like 6 or 8 months, where we took people out of the factory, engineers off their engineering workstations or desks or drawing boards or whatever they used in those days, and sent them to the field with all their credibility and talk to the engineers in these seminars. And that was a very powerful thing. Then finally, the last brilliant tactic was the design win incentive program, where we had told each of the sales folks, you have this quota of design wins you must achieve if you want to get to the golden prize at the end, which is a trip to Tahiti for you and your significant other. And if you get to where your quota is, which is roughly a design win per month on average, which was like 3 times the rate they had been coming in previously, then you have to make sure your district makes it, or else you can't go. And so you help all the folks who didn't get there yet. And that just worked like a charm. Moreover, we were a little bit devious in that starting about halfway through the contest, we started sending brochures about Tahiti to the significant others.
That's right.
To pressure them, to pressure their salesperson. And that worked also very well.
But I remember the design win goal and those initial meetings. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. But
I was about done.
Okay, the design win goal. We're trying to figure out how we're going to measure this. This is Intel. You got to measure it. And I think it was Lally who said we need 1,000 design wins. I mean, it was a number, it was either Bill or Jim, but that number was thrown out, and it seemed like an enormous number. And then as we were developing our plans, somehow that number got changed to 2,000. And that wound up being the number that we wound up taking.
We actually achieved something over 2,300. And that's how virtually everybody in the sales force got to go to Tahiti.
Was there anybody who didn't get to go?
A few.
I recall there were a few, but not very many.
And-
But nobody
were
from the
fired
factory
shortly
got to
thereafter?
go. So this originally, some of the factory people were going to be able to go on this, but the cost was so high because all the factory guys got canceled.
If I have in my notes from one of the early meetings in 1979, December, 6 sort of objectives. One was this whole idea of moving components to systems. And by the way, Dave, you came up with a whole new naming system
That's right.
and strategy, which
Right.
was no
IAPX.
longer from the sort of the product numbers now to a system level kind of identification. 2 was to create the idea that the 8086 was the architecture, not just a product, but an architecture of the 80s. Number 3 was design wins, which Dave just talked about. Number 4 was to use the top management of Intel. I mean, Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce were sort of
Icons.
industry icons. They were bigger than life, and so they really did exude credibility. Number 5 was to give a hint of the future. That is this Futures project, which was sort of to show upward compatibility, because we thought that Motorola really had a product strategy versus sort of an architecture that would evolve into the future. And then, I don't know where I am, but number 6 was that we saw Europe as a big opportunity.
So the upward compatibility of software and positioning the company around a whole product, total product sales strategy was a pretty big change from the way Intel had been operating. How much arm twisting had to go on?
Well, we had a hard rule that we didn't talk about futures till we had time to sell them. And the whole idea that we were going to go out with the 186 and the 286, which were just products in development at that point in time. And we were going to start telling our competitors, because if you tell the customers, the competitors will know what we were doing and the plans relative to our peripheral chips, and then the system level plans. And we created this futures catalog that you talked about that was, you can only get it if you come to the seminar.
What was in that catalog?
It was pseudo data sheets.
186,
They were not
286.
186 and 286 and a bunch of other system level products as well.
Yep.
And development system products
Yep.
that were under development. And it was designed to be like a pseudo data sheet. So it didn't have all the timing specs and all that sort of thing, so you could design with it. But it was an architectural
It says
cell.
here, hint of the future.
A hint of the future, yeah.
was
But you can
not-
only get there if you start with today's products,
Right.
which
Right.
is what we were trying to sell 8086s.
Because we were doing too well selling that against today's products the competitors have, so we thought we'd try selling the ones we're going to have next.
Little smoke and mirrors.
This was the time when Intel objectives were always be and be perceived, right?
Yep.
As, right, you remember? And I remember something about market perception about Intel reestablishing its leadership in the microprocessor.
One of the things was that Buckout had said we're number 3. You know, there's Motorola, there's Zilog, and there's Intel, or another company, customer may be Zilog, Motorola, and Intel, but we're number 3. And one of the objectives is we would be number 1 in perception.
Right.
And that's where the PR campaign
measured
and
by?
the advertising,
Okay.
as measured by the customer's perception.
When
Well,
you
the
ask
thing
a
is-
customer,
Ask the customer, and they would say Intel's
Well,
first.
I remember I had gotten to know the fellow and I don't remember his name at this point, but he ran the microelectronics lab at GE, and he put out a newsletter on microprocessors. Do you remember his name? I don't
I don't
recall it
remember
at
the
this
name,
point.
but I do remember this.
But he once said to me, I was talking to him on the phone, and he said, those little companies that are designing with the 68,000 are capturing our imagination. And so they were getting a lot of the sort of benchmark articles. They were getting a lot of the mind of particularly the journalists that were writing about Motorola as being a leader. And so
So
we had to
the-
do a lot of selling at that level.
so this was basically because we all sold the same. We all sold registers, we all sold components.
We're all semiconductor
We
guys.
were all semiconductor companies. Okay, so this
there
was
was-
what changed
There
us
were
from
two
being.
things that we detected or wrote down and discussed about during our seed meetings. And that was that Zilog was a relatively little company and couldn't keep up with us in manufacturing, in number of projects they could manage, and full sales force support and all of the other things that we had advantages on. And the second one is that Motorola, while they were a big enough company to do that, they were too big. They had the inertia of being a big company with many other diverse product lines and couldn't act as quickly as we could.
I believe I also recall that one sales force at Motorola sold everything they did.
Right.
So selling 68,000s or microprocessors was a very small part of the salesman's job at Motorola.
I think the other big piece of all of this was the shift from hardware to software.
That was a big item. That before it was the hardware engineer. We've been selling into embedded control, and we were selling against sequential state machines designed with MSI logic, and that was a electrical engineer sale.
Right.
And suddenly, with the 8086 and the 68,000, the guys writing the software were the guys who were suddenly making the decisions,
Right.
and we were losing at the software level.
And wasn't we had the software crisis? Was that part of Crush, or did that come later?
That was part of it, but it was probably in 1980, 81.
Yeah.
And it was this whole idea that it was about microprogramming.
Yeah.
And that if you really had to essentially hire all of the engineers to do all the programming in the old way,
Right.
that you would consume all the engineers in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
There weren't going to be enough
actually,
engineers.
So you
Grove-
needed a high-level tool.
Grove
High-level
did
tool,
this. Grove figured out, we were in a cab in New York City, little story, and we were heading to, and I think it was Electronics Magazine or Electronics Design, and we hadn't figured out exactly what he was going to say. And he was scribbling off on an envelope, and he came up with this thing, I think, called the software crisis. And he had done some calculations, literally on the back of an envelope. I think it was a, I don't know, Hilton Hotel envelope. And in effect, he presented that at one of these technical magazines, and they just took it completely to heart and said, yes, that you're absolutely right. And that became a major theme, sub-theme, I think, of the program.
Regis, I'd like to back up and start back to when you came in, you were like an individual advisor or part of the steering committee, but then you had a team at RMI that was helping execute, because I remember RMI people being wandering around the corporate marketing area, working with Larry Kerr's gang in particular. Who else from RMI besides yourself was involved at the execution level?
Oh, boy. you're going to tax my memory. I know that
Delaney
Jack,
was there as our
Bill
ad
Delaney,
guy.
Jack Ramsey were some
Bruce
of the primary
LaBosse?
people.
Was Bruce or Bruce later?
Who?
Bruce
LaBosse.
LaBosse.
Oh, no, much later.
Much
Yeah, I
later.
thought-
Yeah, no. We were pretty small.
Okay.
I mean, we started in 1970, and actually we're growing at this time because of Apple, quite frankly. Apple had, hit 100 million by 1980, and we're growing, significantly. So we had grown pretty well there. But I know the two of the key people were Jack and then we had an art graphics group, and I, and quite frankly, I don't recall all the names.
Speaking of art graphics, can you talk about the decision to use the Nagel art in the campaign? How was that
Well,
received?
that was revolutionary.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
no,
was,
it was
that
different
was,
than anything
that was
we had done.
hugely
And
different.
futuristic.
It was very futuristic, and it was very much a higher level message. Instead of advertising, chips or development systems, this was much higher level.
Yeah, Pat Nagel
Message.
was an illustrator in Los Angeles. Was well known. He was essentially illustrated Playboy articles and had this kind of I think mauve look. You might say very almost Art Deco look to his advertising or his illustrations. And the whole idea was to project Intel as a futuristic company. And so while we gave this systems message, we would use very, very unique kinds of illustrations. And
How hard to sell was that?
Primarily people.
It was
I
all
was
people.
primarily people,
It was
yeah,
all people,
well,
I think.
people, yeah, and the ads won all the awards. I mean, it really did win lots and lots of the awards. It was hard. It was controversial at Intel, and because it was significantly different than anything they had done before. Component, and again, this was this kind of shift
There was
into
no
that world.
milliamps or nanoseconds in those ads.
Right, none, and so.
Who approved them inside Intel?
Nobody.
Nobody
I
but
think you're right.
Well, I think.
I had
It
to
was-
approve them, but I was kind of under the gun. I had to defer to Regis and his
Who
guys.
were you working with? Who was the head of corporate marketing at the time?
Bill?
Well, there was
Was
nobody.
it Bill?
Bill, yeah, either.
I think it was Bill.
Bill and.
I think Bill was the guy that wound up approving him.
Yeah.
Because, Lally had systems, I had components, and there wasn't something
I
that
think
went
that
across.
Boucher's corporate marketing group came out of the Crush program.
Yeah, he came later.
Yeah.
He came later. But I know Andy stopped me once in the parking lot, and he told me that that it would really save Intel a lot of money if they just fired us. And I asked him what that was all about, and he said, well, there's so much debate over those ads that it's all the engineers are standing in the halls arguing over them or talking about them. Some like them, some don't. That if we got rid of you, then we would get rid of the campaign, and then people would go back to work. So
And-
I remember
and-
that's what you wanted. I mean, you wanted it to be noticed. You wanted it to have.
I think
Exactly right.
Gelback had the sales organization at that time under him, and Ed liked those ads, I remember.
Well, Ed was.
He was very
Ed
influential.
also had us come up with an ad at the time that only ran inside Intel, which was, is Intel ready for software? Do you remember that? Because
No, I
this was
don't.
that switch, and it was just an internal. He had it made, I think, just for either Noyce or somebody like that, and he had us come up with it. But and again, my primarily job was, was trying to convince most of the media and the analysts. And I remember sitting with an analyst at Morgan Stanley in their cafeteria and talking to him about Intel. And they said, there's only one systems level company that we're interested in talking to, and that's IBM. And just let you know, at the time, it was not until 1983 that the Wall Street Journal would write an article on a company that was not listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So getting management attention, there wasn't journalists out here. We had to go back there. And Dave and I did a lot of East Coast trips.
That's right.
Bill David Al and I did a lot. Noyce and I did a lot. And so it was selling, if you will, but also convincing them. But I couldn't convince them, but bringing people in, like, I can't underestimate what the impact Bob Noyce had.
Noyce was unbelievable.
Unbelievable. He got it right away. He understood it. He projected. And in fact, I've come across some articles from that time, interviewers, and boy, it's really phenomenal how perceptive and how much how he could project that marketplace.
Rich, you were going to say something about the Nagel ads.
And I'm trying that they were provocative. Was the key. I think that Regis put his finger on it. You want ads that stir things up and get people talking, and these ads certainly did. They had there was a twinge of Star Trek-ness to them.
Well, some of the
in
characters
style.
in the illustration did not have pupils in their eyes.
Oh,
Right.
yes, that's right.
And that really bothered some of our engineers.
That's right.
Yes.
And in fact, it bothered them so much that a later ad was demanded to have a beautiful woman with pupils.
And we did. We did. If you remember, in fact, I have that illustration. I have it copied, but I should have brought it.
The comment I made about nobody approving the ads, there just came a point when the Regis people would be very strongly set about
This is what we need to do.
this is what we need to do, and fortunately, they were most often right, and we'd run stuff.
Regis, it would be very nice if we could get copy of the ads, but I guess I would be more interested in getting copy of the copy that went with the ads, because that was what was really repositioning. The image caught people's attention, but the captions and all that went with those things were what really made
I
it
just
work.
Googled it, and there's nothing to be found on the internet.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of those ads, if not all of them, I know I have one sort of print of one of the illustrations, or maybe two. There are copies of it, but I sold my advertising business to Jay Chiat in 1981, and everything went to him, and all history, artwork, and so forth. So, and it was, by the way, Jay Chiat who I believe led us to Pat Nagel in the first place. He was a close friend of mine. We stayed in touch, even though I had an ad agency, and I had showed him all the work that we were doing, and he was probably the sort of the leading edge agency, still doing Apple's work today in the business. Even at that time, he was my agency when I was at National in 1967, and so that's where it all went. And I've tried to track it down, but not recently.
Okay. One interesting comment that I'd like to have you guys comment on, is Intel's perception of Crush today. I recently made a request of Intel through their museum for any and all materials on Crush for this effort that we're putting our time into today. And the first thing that happened as a result of that is the line went dead. And I thought the person on the other end had hung up on me. And when she finally responded, when I asked and said no, she was still there, she told me the following. She said, Crush is still a verboten topic at Intel. She knows less about Crush than anything she can think about. She knows it was there, but she indicated that she felt this was common throughout the company, is in the majority of not knowing what it was.
Well, it was a very long time ago.
Well, not only that, it became, as we discussed earlier, a legal stay away from.
Well, yeah, Intel went through the whole antitrust. I mean, they've had a lot of history of dealing with antitrust, so I'm sure that discussing a Crush campaign, that T-shirt would have, the government probably would have liked to have that as evidence, your T-shirt.
It's just a T-shirt, we're just kidding around. But there
It wasn't a corporate statement.
Well, there was a Crush 2 campaign.
There was.
That followed that.
It wasn't near as
Energetic.
Energetic, yeah.
Yeah, there was a Woodstock 2 also, and it didn't do as well either. But you know, I think that there was the edginess to the campaign, a subversive nature that was part of this that at least for me, was attractive. This was not your typical corporate campaign. This had an edge to it. There was, and part of it was, you know, traveling under the legal radar to make all of this stuff go. That I think added a level of excitement and commitment to the whole process.
But the transition from components to systems company is still a legacy. And I think that whether people recognize it or not, what Intel is today really was a transition from that whole component world. I mean, if you look at the component companies today, I mean, National Semiconductor was bigger than Intel. I mean, it was started before them. And you know, there are companies that are still in the component business that have never achieved the kind of position and recognition. And it all, I think, you know, is due to that transition from components to systems and what that all meant.
Was the
going
Intel
forward.
delivers and the shift to Intel delivers solutions does it have a direct connection to
No, I can
Crush?
tell you a little bit about that. When I arrived at Intel in February of '74, Intel Delivers was to differentiate the fact that Intel had a policy of shipping to orders in the order that they came in, where our competitors at the end of the quarter would ship to all the high ASP orders. And so the salesman would say, if you really want to get this, you need to give me more money. And so in the business, you never knew whether you were going to get your product or not. And I know Gelbach was very strong in that customers have to depend on us. And the Intel Delivers logo or byline, which was printed on everything in those days, was really a response to our competitors shipping at the end of the quarter to the high ASP orders. And then Intel Delivers Solutions became the byline. And then as we started moving towards ingredient branding, it was Intel, the computer inside became our, and Intel, the computer inside in many ways was the precursor to Intel Inside.
And it was primarily, by the way, initially too, because it was again, Fairchild, because these people had all come from Fairchild, and Fairchild was constantly introducing new products, but so many of them were smoke and mirrors, and that was in the early days, you know, one of the companies they were positioning against.
And that's why we had a policy of not announcing a product until
Right.
we could deliver it.
Right, right.
But to ask my question again, was the enhancement of Delivers to deliver solutions, did that come as a direct response to Crush or part of Crush, or was that just part of some other
I believe
evolutionary?
it was part of Crush as we came up, or Regis's folks came up with the geodesic dome kind of logo, which had all the pieces of the system.
That's right.
And
Yeah, I
then we
remember.
called that the solution. And so we just took the old-fashioned Intel Delivers and put solutions next to it
Right.
as part of
I
Crush.
think it was part of it, yeah.
Let's take a 5-minute break.
Okay?
Okay, go off here.
Okay.
Or 6.
Yeah, one of the things
we
I
doing?
think,
There's coffee, there's some rolls, some carrot sticks.
Camera, you ready? All right, rolling. And I guess what I'd like to do now is move to some of the execution. And the most obvious big execution efforts were these seminars. The one-day seminars, as Jeff has put, I don't recall them as being one-day seminars for major accounts. And the 2-day general seminars, I do recall in very much detail.
That's because we had you on the road doing the 2-day seminars while we sent the executives out for the
Well,
one-days.
the interesting thing was, I did one 2-day seminar at IBM Lagode with Bob Green.
I suspect that the overseas template may have been slightly different than
Okay.
the U.S. one.
Okay. So anyway, I've kind of made a list of the places that I know seminars were held. London, Stockholm, Milan, Tokyo, Los Angeles, Dallas, New York, and the Lagode, France that I was in. Can anybody remember other locations that we had
Well, there
seminars?
were about between 25 and 35 total.
Yeah.
Worldwide. Major marketplaces, Minneapolis was another one, 2 or 3 times in Boston area. And
Any place where we thought somebody
yeah.
might be designing with a microprocessor.
right,
Well, there was a matrix.
Right, there was.
I
Yep.
think I have that somewhere, or by industry.
so we had the industry
telecommunications.
matrix, we had the location matrix, we had the great big map,
Right.
8 feet wide, where we'd put push pins in wherever. One color was seminars, another color was actual design wins. And it was, we managed a war room to keep track
I
of all of
remember
that
the war
activity.
room. Nobody
We just-
took a picture of the war room.
We dedicated
We
one
couldn't have
whole cubicle
cameras.
to it. It had literature stock, it had the map, it had
The big boxes.
the big schedule stuff, a big timeline of who was going where, when.
Right.
But there was a matrix that had it by industry. And it was the computer industry, the telecommunications industry, industrial, and so forth.
Military industrial.
And then it had the top 10 companies in each of those categories. And those became sort of targeted companies,
Yeah.
I think, on the design win. Somewhere I have that, I think.
What was the
We love
role
to
of
scare up.
what was the role of the regional sales managers in this?
They were just kind of cheerleaders.
Well, they all had quotas that they were trying to get their people to hit so they could go to Tahiti.
But they personally didn't get the design wins. It was the sales folks that
No,
did,
I understand
and the
it,
FAEs who did.
but what were they liaison with the factory? What else were they doing besides just sitting in their office?
Specifically relative to the seminar efforts themselves, okay? And add to not only the sales management, but also the FAEs.
Well, the FAEs were central. I mean, the
did all the
FAEs that had
follow-up.
to go in and do the pitch to the customer, they're the ones that was the design win sales force.
Can you talk about Intel's FAE force compared to Motorola's and Zilog's?
Well, we had a significantly larger, we were the first people to come up with it. I remember late in 73 or early 74, I had accepted the job at Intel and hadn't started, and I went to a Ed Gelbach regional manager meeting, and the decision was made. There was a big discussion about do we hire field application engineers, and we decided to do it at that meeting. And then we started adding field application engineers, and the idea was you go into the customer base and find people who had designed with microprocessors and hire them. In fact, you wanted to hire the people who had designed with a competitor's microprocessor, because we didn't want to take people who designed with our microprocessor out. We wanted them to continue to design. And if we could hire the people that designed with a competitive microprocessor, we kind of had a double whammy there. And but they had to be engineers who had designed stuff, and they didn't have a sales quota. Their job was
And
Simply
they
help the
didn't do
customer.
pricing, and they didn't, by the way,
yeah, they couldn't do. they were-
Gelbach got that from Don Valentine.
Is that right?
Valentine initiated that at National Semiconductor.
No kidding.
He hired people out of the customer base. They were not
Okay.
assigned any quotas, but their job was to get design wins.
There was also a second program, roughly the same time as Crush, where instead of hiring experienced designers from the customer base, we were hiring new grads in computer science and in EE, and in marketing and finance, and we called them technical sales engineers, TSEs.
Yep.
And they were very instrumental in the Crush program too, because the combination of the TSE and the FAE were the follow-up team. After we did a seminar, either at a major account or a public seminar, it was their business cards that we handed out. And all the customers that had questions to be asked had to get through that sales office. And then they'd, of course, have their assigned field sales engineer.
Incidentally, I think that's another real kind of critical thing, because when you're talking about sort of you expect the regional salespeople to do this feedback, but I think one of the things that Intel learned from like the Buckout memo was that the field application engineers were working directly with the design teams at customers, and that feedback was directly into the engineering at Intel. So there was this closed loop thing that was a kind of trusted relationship. They knew each other's business. They knew each other how to adapt and and solve problems that way.
So
not
while
as part of Crush, but at the same time and previous to it and after it, there were regular field application engineer conferences in the factory where we would expose new products and teach them about them, but also there would be major sessions in there about what are you hearing from your customers.
and what does
good
the
or bad.
customer
They
want
would
you
also
to do, right?
They would also critique our products, what was
Yeah.
wrong with
Right.
the products that were out there and what was wrong with the products we had in development. They were an important part of the product definition process.
Yeah, very critical, I think.
Now, at
Help-
that
help
time,
helped the board group too. I mean, we changed product line directions because of feedback we got from the field.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah.
if my memory serves me correctly, most, if not all of our FAEs at that time were generalists, but they were focused on designing microprocessor systems, not designing memory systems.
Oh, they were all microprocessor
Right.
design
All of
engineers.
right.
And-
First
and
guy,
some-
by
and
the
some
way, was
guys were-
hired by Bill, the regional manager in O'Brien, Bill O'Brien.
On the West
In the
Coast.
Los Angeles area, and unfortunately, I don't remember his name, but that was the first hire we
Yes,
had.
you're right, you're right.
And.
I forgot what his name was, you're right.
So at some point, and I'm just trying to establish timelines here, at some point, we started adding specialists to our microprocessor or our FAE organization.
Software folks, I think.
Software focus, architecture focus, et cetera.
That's
Was
right.
that during or part of Crush, or did that happen at some
I think it
subsequent?
came a little later at the 286 level,
Okay.
when the software became quite complex, and we needed real software engineers, not double E's, to help the customers.
I remember you talking about the technical sales engineers, Gelbach saying, we're going to go out and we're going to find those B and C grade engineering students who were active in athletics or they were in fraternities, but they had a personality. You know, we're not going to try to hire the A students. We're going to hire the guys who had all these extracurricular activities going on.
They understood building relationships and
That's right.
So one of the things that I recall and kind of like your opinion on is, I remember having field application engineers do part of our 2-day seminars.
Yes.
Okay, so there must have been a training session or something,
was,
because
and
we
part
were
of the-
actually going out in two-man teams at part of that time.
Yeah, but part of the theory there was to expose them to the customer and give them credibility with the customer. Also to get them trained. If you know, there's no way to learn something like teaching it, and so getting them to the position where they could handle the material.
how did you manage quality control to make sure that the messages stayed on target? And because one of my experiences working with field sales organizations is they kind of like to customize things.
Well, every one of the seminars had a factory team, as I said, with factory engineers and marketing management.
There was a standard set of foils,
And so
and there was a
we
notebook
used-
that went along with it that you delivered. So you know if you got those transparencies, because remember we
Now,
didn't
this
have
is
slides
before
and we had
PowerPoint. and-
Actually,
Did we have slides? Did we
we
make
had
slides?
35
35
we had
millimeter slides.
two-
We had the canisters.
now we had two 240
I remember
slot canisters.
absolutely carrying around those boxes of slides.
Some people did. Some people had foils. I remember, absolutely, I remember the session in Milan, which was, I'm back there now, and it looked like the UN Security Council built facility. This huge, enormous table where the audience was sitting like a boardroom, and we were way up on this raised stage with this giant screen behind us. Looking back, it's a 2-story building, looking up at the glassed-in place where the translators were feverishly
Oh, yes.
trying to
Yep.
translate what we were saying into Italian. And some poor guy from the field office sitting on the floor, flipping foils all day long.
And I remember
Flipping
we would
foils.
meet with the translators before and go over some of the material
yeah.
so that they would know how to say, the technical terms.
Well, that's a good idea. I don't think we did that.
Yeah, I remember
Well,
doing that.
Jeff, I think in the war room, you had this box, I think it was wood.
No, that was
was
the
the previous,
Klingon
Yeah, that's the
neutralization
Klingon
kit.
box.
That
Yeah.
was the predecessor to Crush, which,
Klingon
what do we, Star Wars?
neutralization
Yeah.
What was,
Yeah.
8085. We
Yeah.
were after the enemy was the Klingons from Star Wars.
and that was a Klingon neutralization kit. And
It
so,
was-
so we had this idea in
But
the
it was a
factory.
pitch on everything.
They were
Well,
literally
yes.
ammunition boxes.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
were
Rifles.
And our whole idea was that the salesman could go through and put together his presentation. So there were like
Right.
25 copies of every slide or
right,
something.
I remember that,
And-
yeah.
and
Sent
the-
one to every field office.
And the field office thought that was the most ridiculous thing that would ever happen because they had copy machines. You know, just said, why we have this big wooden box in our office? But it made a big impact.
Yeah, it sure did.
But it's sort of the precursor to Crush.
I remember one quality control event. As we were saying, we brought a bunch of folks from the factories. Many of them were engineers that hadn't done presentations. And I'm telling you, this place in Milan was just a daunting presentation place. And one of the presenters, for the first time, got up and he froze. He just froze. And it was a couple or three very awkward minutes, and we finally escorted him from the podium, and we had a backup guy who stepped up and did the slides, and I guess that
Where was this?
I remember,
that was in Milan.
I remember two events in that seminar series that that still stick with me. One was my learning how to pace myself in a foreign language with translators, because our 2-day seminar filled up 2 days in the U.S. But when you have to talk for 4 sentences and wait for somebody in Japanese to say what you just said in 10 sentences,
It
you
takes
couldn't get
longer.
all the stuff in. So
Right.
you had to decide while he's talking, or she is, mostly he's, what am I going to say next for four?
What's the
three
most
more
important
sentences?
point I
Yeah.
can
Particularly in Japan.
Yeah, to get it
Yes.
all in the 2
Yeah.
days. So that was one new lesson I learned. The other one was travel was kind of brutal. We'd do 4 sessions a week, 4 different cities, but they're 2-day sessions. So I'd do day 1 and then go to the next city for day 1, and somebody else is doing day 2 at the first city. And so every night you have dinner with the local team. You get on a plane at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. You show up at close to midnight. And I got a cold on the way on one of those weeks. And I woke up the next morning, having almost lost my voice the day before, with 0 voice. And I didn't have a backup at that point for day 1. And so I took the microphone like this and I stuck it down my throat practically and whispered the whole seminar. Until about noon, when Bob Green was snatched away from his day 2 session and came and finished my 1 day for me.
Wow.
And that's where I met Beeston, right? Wasn't the Crush thing? I get Multibus 2 and Crush stuff confused, but I know we were in Eindhoven. I know Bill Maxey was there. We'll see him tonight. Remember we did London, but I get that confused with
Eindhoven was
BT
Philips, right?
and
Philips.
yeah, Eindhoven was Philips. And I remember Bill Maxey was finishing the seminar and then starting his sabbatical, and going to see the running of the bulls, and we ended up in Venice together, just coincidentally, but that's another story. So I remember Brussels, remember London, Eindhoven, Brussels, Paris, Milan. I think that's it. At least those are the ones I remember.
Well, we had to go to Ivrea because that's where Olivetti was headquartered.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was, in many ways, a precursor is, there was a campaign, Olivetti was about ready to make a decision, and I remember going there. I remember calling Tom Lawrence when he ran Intel Europe, and he was in Bali on vacation, and saying, Bill, you got to come home. We got an important appointment in Ivrea. You've got to come. And they were about ready to make a decision on a microprocessor, and we parachuted in. I was there and made the pitch. I think it was pre-Crush because it was more of a component futures pitch. It was the first time I remember ever, opening the kimono. so
That
to
might
say.
have been a prototype for the future.
And talking to them about what what we had coming next.
It was a prototype for the futures. It was also where we got one really important message that we didn't have initially, and that was the systems concepts were really reinforced by Olivetti. I've seen a number of notes that indicated that they liked what they saw, but they didn't see how it related to systems solutions, and we got that.
I remember
That's where
going
the hint
in-
of the future came from, too.
Right,
Was that
right.
presentation.
Remember going and staying in the Typewriter Hotel. Remember they had a hotel that looked like, Olivetti was famous for typewriters.
Right.
They had a hotel that looked like a typewriter, and every room was a key, and every room had a balcony. And when you went inside the room, it looked like you were in a ship cabin. It was all done with wood and very modern. And going to Olivetti, being very, with a tie on and being very humid and perspiring and waiting for the execs to come out and making this pitch in a very formal sort of setting about the future.
You've talked several times, all of you, about the executive to executive presentations, and that was a shift in the industry, certainly. How were they received by customers? And
Well, first thing was why do we need to talk to a semiconductor company? When you go and you want to talk with the VP of engineering or the CEO of a computer company or systems company, that had always been delegated to the components guys, which were basically the purchasing department. And the problem was always, why should I talk to these people? And David Howe had made the point that choosing a microprocessor architecture is the most important decision you're going to make for the 80s. We have the architecture for the 80s. This is the most important decision you're going to make. It's a decade-long decision. This is not a decision you should delegate to your people. This is a company-changing decision, and that's why you need to talk to us.
Yeah, there were just critical economic issues that I think were more conveyed executive to executive, more credible, and that on that level. And it was the economics of time to market, of being able to essentially prototype and turn around into production very, very quickly, flexibility. There was a lot of key benefits that came out of, I think, the program that you all had put together, that the executive management level at least began to question, are we on the right path? And I think that was really why that program was put into place.
And we would send an executive from our company simply because we wanted them to feel like, since we were sending a member of the executive staff, they had to have somebody of equal status there. And so we sent people that had nothing to do with microprocessors, nothing to do with crush. They just had the right business card.
Right.
Well, I remember doing that with Bob Noyce at.
Well, Bob could get an audience with anybody.
He couldn't get,
Yeah,
exactly.
He could get in
really
anywhere.
Didn't need Crush to do that.
But I remember specifically going in with him during that time period to the outfit in Radio Shack.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Tandy down
and
in
flying
Texas.
in there, and of course he flew in. I think it was in the Rockwell at the time. Ann was working for Apple by then, so she came along because Apple had some stuff going on there. But we ended up with the executive staff from Tandy in their executive dining room on their executive china with their entire staff, and being served by about 12 young ladies dressed in French maid costume. I mean,
Welcome to
this
Texas.
was the Texas Tandy approach at
Yep.
the time.
Oh,
And, but you're right, Bob could get an audience with anybody.
Their executive
Roach.
quarters were pretty
yeah, the
nice.
name of the guy, though, that actually put them in the PC business.
Isn't it Roach? Somebody Roach?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The PC business or the original Z80 design?
No, the original
The
PC.
Tandy,
Dandy.
TRS-80.
TRS-80.
Yeah.
But it was a
John
Z8,
Roach, I'm guessing.
Z80
Yeah,
design.
And he
it's a
became
Roach.
CEO
Yeah,
of
John
the company
Roach.
based
John
on that
Roach.
success.
Yeah.
John Roach.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's
Yeah,
exactly
I
who
have
we
a
were
great
meeting
story
with.
He was a
I'd like to see
Texan.
him.
Yeah, I've got several. We probably couldn't
Jeff, can
put
you
on
talk a
tape.
little bit about the Godfather when is it
Well,
got to be more
as
formally
part
known?
of the executive to executive seminar program, there was a follow-up system where the executive assigned to any given major account, and they were, as somebody has just mentioned, all over Intel. They weren't just microprocessor folks. I traveled with Craig Barrett, who at the time was the QA guy. Anyway, each executive that went out to visit with a major account was assigned to be that account's godfather. And whenever the sales force needed any help with that account, they could call their godfather, who would remove any roadblocks in the factory to make sure that that sales guy or
Got what he
girl
wanted.
got exactly
Needed.
what was needed. And they formed nice relationships. The godfather and his or her counterpart in the major account became close with each other, which was very useful to us.
And the Godfather was supposed to visit the customer at a certain frequency.
Yeah, or visit or at least call
Yeah.
on a
They had it
monthly or
in their,
quarterly
in
basis.
their MBOs, I believe.
Yes,
Twice a year.
twice a year, was it?
Yes.
And call them like monthly or something.
Which is a very effective thing to keep reinforcing that major
This is-
decision from
This is
the
a company
top.
decision. This is not a programmer decision or an engineer decision. This is a corporate decision you're making.
Rich, you were talking about Milan and London. Do you recall the fact that when we did the Milan seminar, we had a London seminar the following morning? They weren't staggered like Jeff was talking about, where you did day one here and then moved on. That particular week was 2 days in Milan, 2 days in London. But Alitalia went on strike on Tuesday night,
Oh, I don't remember that.
and we couldn't get most of the team from Milan to London. But we had had the foresight to take all the 35 millimeter slides for day one, which we'd finished, and ship them with our FAE ahead.
So did the FAE deliver the?
The
Slide.
FAE and the sales staff kept those guys engaged till 11 o'clock when we finally showed up.
Wow. Wow.
When did you begin to get a sense this was working? What were, did the design win just start to mount up, or?
It was, I'll take that one because we had the war room there, and the push pins started filling up the
Multiplying.
map. And we knew that we were going to achieve certainly our first 1,000 design wins target, and we'd be pretty close to getting to 2,000
How early on
by
was that?
about midsummer.
It wasn't until well into the year.
Yeah. And then by October, November timeframe, they were just rolling in because everybody was trying to scramble to get their ticket
go to
to
Tahiti.
Tahiti.
That's right.
But I think what Bill Davidell said, it was the most intense marketing campaign ever conducted by a technical company. And I think that intensity, normally would be spread out over probably years in a lot of other companies. But this was really a 6 months effort. And then the weekly meetings, you got updates all the time. So at least as I go through my notes, I see, meetings,
Yeah.
regular meetings in which you get updates.
And only Intel could have done that.
Yeah.
The microprocessor was too small of a part and not as critical at National.
and
Zilog was too small, and they were spread very thin, trying to keep up with Intel. Motorola was too big. It had these large, the telephone business and the telephone equipment switching business, and at that day, the radio business, handheld two-way radios were a really big part. And then they had semiconductors, were really that division was created to support the phones and the switches and that sort of thing. And the outside business was only a part of their charter. And I'll repeat the story about several years ago. As part of the Computer History Museum's video history series, we organized the 68020 team, reassembled that team that designed that product, and I went down and played the role that Dane and Rosemary were playing in terms of interviewing the people, and we got together before and talked about it, and I couldn't get them to talk about the 68020 because they wanted to hear about the crush campaign, and they told about the frustration they had because they realized, they got word that we were starting this big marketing campaign. They knew the word crush, by the way. So they felt like they had to do something, so they went to the head of that division, the semiconductor division, and he had to go to corporate marketing and corporate sales. So one of the corporate advertising marketing people, and we need a campaign to support this big microprocessor push. And they said, well, let's prioritize that along with our, first we're running this campaign for this division, this one, and we think we can get to you later in the year, or early next year. And he went to the sales force, and of course they were selling the whole line, and they said, well, we've got these programs we're running now, and maybe we can put some resources together. So they were too big, and they said a frustration that they had is they were a bunch of design engineers with hardly any marketing, and they were trying to do what we were doing as a corporation. And they didn't have the sales force behind them. They didn't have the corporate marketing. They didn't have the corporate advertising behind them. It was futile. We knew we had a better architecture, but we just couldn't compete with this campaign, and we couldn't mobilize Motorola.
So Al Stein, who was the GM at Motorola at the time, later on, he came to Silicon Valley. I think he was president of one of the semiconductor companies.
VLSI.
Yeah,
Technology.
and he told me that when I told him the time frame that Crush took place and how pulled together the whole energies of the company within a few weeks, he said it would have taken him that long to get a ticket to go to Chelmsford to even present the notion to his top management. And so those companies just moved slowly for a lot of various reasons. But I also knew Gary Boone, who invented the microprocessor at TI. Some say before Ted Hoff actually came up with it. In fact, I think there was a patent dispute.
Oh, there was a big,
And he told me that when he first took the idea of a computer on a chip to his top management, he was told, young man, don't you know computers are getting bigger, not smaller? So there was a whole different mindset that was going on, I think, in the competitive marketplace, which Intel was, I mean, the management was very, very progressive and very willing to change.
This is probably a good place for me to jump in and to repeat something that Bill said to me as he was leaving. He said, I'm sitting here listening to all of this, and he says, I still can't believe we did it. He said, I don't know of another group of people in another company that could have pulled it off.
well, and I think an important thing to comment on, although I don't know that there was ever a direct link between the Crush campaign and the IBM PC design win, which was the defining design that made Intel the king of microprocessors for all time. But that product was introduced sometime in early 81, and we remember the telex came in early in December, and the whole internal campaign was put together in December. And right after Christmas and New Year's, it was launched at the corporate level with our big session that we had all the corporate people. And then after that, it was this number of series during 1980 that we were doing all these different presentations. And it was during that time, and this is another topic for another time, another video history, but it was in that time that we were starting to hear about some activity in Boca Raton that wound up, only a year after we launched the Crush campaign, IBM announced the IBM PC. So the impact that might have had, I think we could speculate on, we don't know. But clearly, you're asking about the momentum. In the summer, we started seeing these design wins all of a sudden.
We didn't see IBM at that time.
We did not see IBM. We did not see IBM. The enthusiasm grew as the success in the second half of the year, and then we were hearing, as Dane knows, about the activities in Boca about the same time. But it wasn't. I don't know that it was ever a pin on the map.
Well, because I think it took IBM a while to decide that they were going to outsource the processor and the software. They initially, because they made everything themselves.
That design from the beginning was using an industry.
Boca Raton was specifically set up to deal with
but
outside
before Boca
semiconductor
Raton,
companies.
whenever
Right.
they were looking at the initial, and
Right.
the decision at that time was that now this is from Jack Keeler, who was president at the time, that IBM didn't go into a market that wasn't at least $100 million. And Apple had hit that point in 1980. And so that really went over the edge, and it was time then at IBM to where they had to really do something fast, and that's when they set up Boca Raton. And,
okay, so, but we'll cover that in another time. But there is some interesting timing relative to the...
Well, the stars were aligned for...
The stars were absolutely aligned.
Yeah.
Going back,
You were talking about design wins and momentum. I have a story to share. Most of the big design wins were the component wins, but there were some at the board level. And there were a few districts down in Philadelphia, Buckouts region in New York, up in Seattle, Chicago, Conrad Wiederhold. Those were hotspots for system level activity. And in Philadelphia was Leeds and Northrop. And Pete Del Vecchio, DM
I
down,
remember the name.
right? I believe was the DM there. And this was one of their big morale wins that they needed to get, and it was about a board level product. But they needed parity memory. We didn't have parity memory on our board. So we figured out how to create an add-on board in a very short period of time. That saved the deal. And it was one of those design wins. So in early April, we were doing the equivalent of the business unit update meetings at the time. There were everybody in the systems business that was in Oregon was in the cafeteria. I don't know, a couple of 300 folks. And I got to tell the story about this design win and what happened and the thing and why it's important and engineering and the board and all of that. And it was great. Tom Kinnan sitting there. He was my boss at the time, I think. Bob Brannan's in the audience. He was marketing manager at the time. And I said, I want to tell you, I had so much fun working with these Leeds and Northrop guys that I'm announcing my resignation from Intel. And jaws dropped. And I said, I just have one more slide to say in appreciation for all this. And the last slide that I put up showed a joker from a deck of cards, and up above it, it said April Fools. And it was, in fact, April Fool's Day.
Jeff, what was the feedback from the field? When did you get a sense that the field had was pumped about it? Was it
they were immediately pumped because as soon as we did the factory kickoff meeting in early January, we immediately sent teams to the field offices worldwide and told them about what was going on, and they were preceded in each of those meetings in the field with a video from Andy Grove telling the field how important it was and that they would all get something out of it if they got a lot of design wins. And then we went and told them about the 9 programs and told them about the products and the glimpse of the future they could now sell that they never were able to before. There were so many things that the field loved to hear. They were instantly jazzed. And they started doing their thing, looking for design wins by February, probably, or March at the latest.
As a follow-on to that, when do you think the field thought they had really turned the corner and were winning designs?
Midsummer-ish, or maybe, early fall.
Okay.
But they were jazzed. They had more confidence than we did, I think, in the beginning.
I think they did. Now, we were not only an x86 or 8086 product line and a board product line that we were selling and whatnot.
Development systems product line.
We're all doing, all the systems product went along with it. Nobody's mentioned anything about the single chip processors, the 8048, 49, 8051.
Well, that was an important part of it. Selling into the embedded design was a critical part of this. And the development system obviously played a role there. We had development system tools for those products. They didn't use as much memory, but and the software products were probably a little less sophisticated for that line maybe. But they played a definite role. And we didn't really differentiate as highly at that point in time. Later, that group was split off from the microprocessor.
We had high integration and high performance.
And moved to down to Chandler, and it became more differentiated at that time. But in these days, I don't remember if we were
It was just part of the major total solution. If you wanted to just do logic replacement, you used a single chip. If you had to do something that was reprogrammable with a new flavor every time you powered it up, or potentially a new flavor, then you used the real microprocessor with the wider, bigger address space and more capable software.
Although the single chip devices came with EEPROM memories, so that there was a potential of modifying code
You
and
could do
updating
that,
things.
but
They have
that
the
was
8748 and the 8751.
that was not for real-time reprogrammability.
Correct.
That was for periodic updates.
These are microcontrollers.
Microcontrollers,
Yeah.
single chip.
Incidentally, just a little story. I'm a diabetic. I've been a diabetic for 55 years, and I use an insulin pump. So during those days, I read about this, which again was much larger, and it was invented by a guy named Dean Kamen.
Oh, is that right?
Dean
That's
Kamen, the Segway.
The Segway guy.
So
yeah.
I called him, and I wanted to find out what processor he used in this. And he used a microcontroller. And so he started describing to me on the phone for, I don't know, 2 hours, how he designed that. So it goes back
Was
to
it
looking.
an Intel one, though?
I think it was, yeah. I mean, I don't think I have my notes on that, but I
Let's
remember
open
that
that
was.
thing up, come on.
Yeah,
Where's your curiosity?
right. Well, it was then, it's not now. Anyway, so that's how I met Dean Kamen.
Well, I remember the other portion of the IBM design was the keyboard controller.
Oh, yeah.
And that was an 8048 design. I think we had a
Yeah.
specific number for it.
And
at
that
one
was
point.
logic replacement.
And that was logic
Yeah, yeah.
replacement. But I remember something else about that, particularly when we had competition from AMD, because every keyboard that was shipped had an 8042 in it.
I think that's 8041 and 8042. The 8042 had more memory.
Yeah, right. But that was a ROM programmed device, so we knew
exactly how many computers IBM
were
was
being
shipping.
shipped, whether or not, and we could tell what our percentage was,
Yep.
which was pretty high. Okay.
So what kind of, you've told the Motorola story, and Regis,
Yeah.
maybe you're a good person to ask this question of, because you were on the call or meetings with analysts and reporters. Kind of what was the external rest of the world of industry watchers' response to Crush? Did they even notice it? You know, kind of what did they have to say?
Well-
Kind of like Fight Club? First
No,
rule.
I think that not so much the analysts early on, but I think more the media, particularly the technical media, they were rooting more for Intel than Motorola. Motorola was not really a marketing company. And I think one of the things that I, excuse me, that I would really say about Intel is the fact that I was on the first group says something about Intel, really emphasizing marketing, which they began then in earnest. I think other than just sort of being an adjunct to selling, it began in, hey, we really have to market this product. And so I think that particularly having me, Dave, Bill, David, Al, and others going and actually spending time in New York with, say, the journalists and the analysts, that made a huge difference because I remember the editor of Business Week saying to me, none of these guys from TI or Motorola ever visit us. We've got to go see them, and we went to see them because, and sitting across the table, talking to people, explaining it to them, I think that very early on, they really started to get on the bandwagon. I mean, we ended up a lot of covers. We ended up with an awful lot of attention. We got all of our articles placed that we wanted placed, and we got a huge amount of media in that first 6 months.
Dave, who were you working for on ESM at the time?
Let me see. So in 78 or 76, it was Bill, David, Al. Then it would have been Les Fidesz.
So did he shower you with praise for Crush being such a success?
I don't remember Les ever showering me with
Anybody.
praise for
Anybody.
anything.
That thought came to
I
everyone's
think
mind.
Karsten came in there about that.
Karsten
too.
came in 81. I worked for Jack. I'll remember this very explicitly from January of 81 to January of to the end of 80 to January of 83. And in January of 83, Grove became my supervisor. But so it was Videz at that point in time.
Well, I guess embedded in that question, or that question is embedded.
Reduced beating was the best.
Right, my first year and a half at Intel, I reported to less. That's part of my question our reason for asking. But it kind of was there any praise that filtered down to you guys and that you're doing a good job?
Not at first. And then, interestingly enough, after the crush program ended and we spent the money was all spent, there was still no revenue. There we had a lot of development system revenue during the crush program, and some board revenue was coming in all along, but the chips were still under development at the customer base. And so at my quarterly reviews with executive staff, they kept saying, where's all of the money from these design wins? And this went on till well into the 80s, until the IBM PC clones started coming into the market in the 83 or 4. So
there wasn't dancing in the halls.
no,
Well,
we
yeah,
we
it
Well,
knew
we had our
did
celebration.
well.
We-
We knew
we-
we had all these design wins, but here's another side note. One of the seminars was in London, and I was there, and it was the opening month or so of the musical show Annie in London, which I managed to get to see. And I kept wanting to come back and tell Andy Grove, the sun will come out tomorrow.
Moore's Law does come into play. Volumes count in this business. Despite the fact that we moved into the systems business, volumes of the chip really does matter. And I was looking at some of the old literature here, and in 1983 to 84, Intel had 5 consecutive quarters of losses. And so the memory systems, the RAM business, had declined due to foreign competition largely and pricing. And the microprocessor business, all those design wins hadn't reached volume yet. And so there was this period in which, quite frankly, the IBM business became really, really critical, because IBM then invested to the tune of $250 million in Intel that really did dig them out of a hole. Intel, quite frankly, didn't want to take the money. I remember Bob Noyce being really upset over it. They thought perhaps this meant the eventual decline of Intel as becoming a part of IBM, but that didn't take place. IBM, several years later, then sold the stock, and it went back to wholly owned again.
Actually sold the stock and made a huge amount of
Made a
money.
huge
on it.
amount of money, but at the time, it was a critical investment.
Right.
And it helped that ramp up in order to be prepared for the volumes that were to follow with the IBM business and the clones.
Rich, you mentioned earlier that in spite of the fact that Jeff was not doing well in the early days of the x86, your system level business, your board business, was doing pretty well at
Shorter
that time.
design cycle.
Pieces of it. I mean, systems group was always the unfulfilled promise, unfulfilled potential of the business, and we'd oscillate back and forth between, we're there to make money as a standalone business. No, you're really there to be in strategic support of the component side of the business. So even the charter would vacillate annually, or I guess depending upon how much the rest of the company was suffering. But within that business, the 16-bit boards was, I think, the most successful product line to date, built on that multi-bus stuff. We had a range of products. Designing with the 16-bit components was more challenging. The chips were faster, the boards were denser, there was more capability packed onto it. So it was harder to get started. And having the board products there was, I think, a great stepping stone that helped reduce time to market. As long as those design cycles were, it did help reduce stuff. There were a number of companies that went into production with the boards, and they'll get around to redesigning an optimal product later on, which they rarely did. So I do think that and we started having RMX 86, which is another whole story, but provided some level of one of the key components of, well, if you're a solutions business, then having a runtime operating system is an important part of all of that. So I do think that systems group in that way did help lead some of the messaging around the solution stuff, because that's what our business was and at least some of the revenue that reflected it.
It was also a great example of how to make the things work if you hadn't
Right.
done it yet.
Right, right, I think that's.
Yeah.
Buy a board and copy it.
Yeah, did you, well, I think
Change
we
the
actually
design, but-
offered
Yeah.
schematic
Yeah.
diagrams of
We
them,
did.
so
We,
people
we,
could do
we
that.
we offered everything, and for people that had bought enough, we'd give them all of the manufacturing documentation. So if you think you're going to get locked in and you want to build these boards yourself, we'll give you all of that. So that make versus buy decision was a big piece of the selling process, and I don't think anybody ever took us up on actually making the boards
But
themselves.
they liked that as a backup.
Oh, they liked it.
Absolutely, and
Yeah,
it,
much
it
more
gave you
personal.
it gave you that degree of comfort that you weren't going to get locked in.
Right. Did you see an upturn in your business during this period that was a result directly of the crush effort? Or was that also, translated to later, like the component side was?
Well, I mean, there were some of these highly visible design wins, like the Leeds and Northrop one, and a few others where I can directly point to business that came out of it. But the PC business didn't have a positive effect on the multibus business. Because in a lot of cases, what were the design engineers doing? They were taking our boards and they were wrapping them in sheet metal and putting a power supply with them, and they wanted this other stuff, and they needed monitors and all that. Well, gee, that sounds a lot like a PC. So the entry point then for playing around with x86 architecture then became the PCs as opposed to the single board computers. The single board computers are more evolved in embedded applications, but once the PC took off, I mean, that world of reprogrammable systems really took off, and the multibus business didn't participate as much in that. It was really more about
The
embedded
development
systems.
system business was also heavily impacted by the PC and eventually eliminated.
Eliminated,
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Jeff, we haven't at all mentioned the distribution channel, which must have played some role in this.
The main purpose
crush
of the distribution channel was to organize and establish the logistics for the seminar series. The sales offices had the prime responsibility, but they depended heavily on the local distributors to get the customers to show up.
So they were essentially Intel's partner in crime
Indeed,
here.
yeah.
Right. The other thing there are two things that have been mentioned but not really gone into here. One is how important the software tools that we had on our development systems were towards making this program really go. And the other one was we had this in-circuit emulation capability, which nobody else in the industry ever had. And what effect did it have on these efforts?
I think that was huge. I think the development systems business is what made it less costly and take less time to develop with our architecture, even though we didn't have enough registers and we didn't have enough address
So
space.
time to market
within
was
it, but
very
the time to
positively
market, and it was the thing we could lean on when we went to the VP of engineering or the CEO of the company in terms of saying, you're making a big decision and it incorporates all this stuff, and we had the industry beat. And you point out that the insert emulator allowed the customer engineer to pull the 8086 out and plug in this adapter that allowed you to put in breakpoints and traces and do all the stuff in hardware at real speed, which these were largely real-time systems, was so critical to be able to debug their systems. And nobody could touch that.
And PLM was a real solid language at the
was.
time. I mean, it was a lot easier to use than an assembler, for sure. It didn't have all the overhead of some of the high-level languages. It ran fast.
Gary
it
Kildall.
was, yeah, Kildall.
Gary Kildall, yep.
It really filled, I think, an important role in that transition period to when third-party tools really started to take over.
Well, the boards and the development systems were in fact the major metric by which we measured a design win. You could get a letter from an engineering manager
That's right.
saying we're going to
Right.
use your chip, but it really, only for certain customers would we trust that. But when they bought a development system or a board to start practicing with, that was a guaranteed
That was the
design
metric.
win.
That was
the metric
Yeah.
Right.
that we
Right.
used.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the development systems, I remember, I think it was Lally created a chart later on, but it showed the rise of the development systems and then the volume
Of
in
the
chips. Yeah,
microprocessor
the
followed it.
microprocessors
But
following
it would
by
follow by 2
6
years.
months, something like
6
that, or a
months
year.
to 2 years.
Yeah,
Yep.
On the 8085s and the 8-bit
Right.
ones, it was 6 months. By the 16-bit ones, it was out to 2 years.
right, okay.
Hence my
Right,
Broadway
because
singing
I've used that
career.
in other,
Yes.
I've used that in other places.
You've talked about Motorola's reaction here. Does anybody have any comments on Zilog's reaction to being crushed?
Well, having talked to Bernard Puto, who was in the software, running the software over there, his comment was, we were trying to keep up with what you were doing, and so we were developing the 8-bit processor that was so successful, the Z80, and then they had a Z8 to go after our embedded control processors, the 8048, 8051 series. And then they had their Z8000 to go after the 8086, and they felt that they had a superior product in each case, but then they realized they had to provide the software, and they just didn't have the people, they didn't have the bandwidth, and so they were trying to put this together on schedules that were just impossible with not enough resources, and they just couldn't keep up with that bandwidth. I think they even tried to do a development system, as I recall.
Yeah, but it was never very competent. After the fact, we determined, this is like 2 years, 3 years later, that as a result of Crush, we pretty much put the Z8000 out of business. Correct. From Zilog. And we severely wounded the 68000. Didn't put it out.
Yeah, it continued to have success. Well,
That's
Apple
the
used it.
lawyers.
Apple.
Why the lawyers are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it won't let Intel employees talk
We'll-
about
we'll-
Crush.
We'll raise that out.
That was a perceived result by us. We perceived that we didn't have Zilog much as a competitor anymore at the 16-bit level. They were still killing us at the 8-bit level.
Yeah, the Z80
Yeah.
continued. There's probably people still using
still-
Z80.
And the competition for in the 16-bit level from Motorola got squeezed down into a few reprogrammable only applications.
Well, Apple was one of them,
Apple
and I
was
think
one.
Sun was the other one, if
Yes.
I
Yeah.
remember correctly.
Yeah.
And wherever there was any amount of embedded control, Intel was winning it at the 16-bit level. And then we think that was because of the Crush.
You've, all along, each one of you told a kind of an anecdote or a story that was associated with Crush. Do you have any others that haven't been put on the table that you'd like to include? Jeff, you must have, I mean, you were at kind of the center of the whirlwind.
It was kind of a whirlwind. I would say it was among the top 3 or 4 years of my career in terms of stimulus and results. And I felt pretty good about myself at the end of it. In particular, I became much better at defending my work to Andy by the end of it.
Yeah.
Well, the success probably made it easier.
Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, as the chief culprit at the beginning, and also the chief beneficiary of the whole company getting behind my product, I went from a staff of 5 people to a staff of essentially 75 people who were doing everything I needed to be done to make my product successful. And that was something that no other company or division within that company ever achieved, as far as I know.
And what time frame did that grow from 7 to 75?
2 weeks.
Well, it wasn't exactly 2 weeks.
No,
because
but the point was,
but you had the license.
The major kickoff meeting in January engaged everybody. And by the end of January, they were all working.
And I remember drafting people. I mean, it was, we were reassigning people left and right.
I don't mean permanently. The task force
Yeah.
was working in my behalf. And largely at mine and Dave's and the rest of our team's direction, the steering committee's direction. But I was the chief bureaucrat, feeling that I could, finally change the world.
And you did.
Just maybe one note of dissonance is this was by no means an easy transition for Intel as a corporation to move from the memory products into the microprocessor world, there was a lot of internal issues.
Andy wrote a book about it, Only the Paranoid Survive.
Yeah, but it was also I remember Barry Cox was running Memories, I think, at the time. Or at
I
least
think
he was
so,
saying
yes.
about it.
I think so.
And they were really, I mean, it was this two sides of the house.
They were jealous.
And they didn't see a future for themselves because so much of the resources and everything else. And I think he was up in Portland at the time because we had an office up there. I spent a lot of time with them up there. And they were pounding the tables and wanting more attention and wanting to know what their future was going to be. And so, I remember talking to Andy about it and saying, you really need to make a decision here as to what's going on. And he was trying to set up a meeting, he told me, between he and Gordon and Bob to kind of make some decisions about because it was a critical point at which we were either going to throw this way or sort of be mediocre and try to be a little bit of everything. And I think that's when Andy had written also about the fact that they made the decision that they're going to become, a
Well,
microprocessor
that really
company.
started the battle that went on from 1980 to 1985, and I think that Andy's book talks about the decision to get out of the DRAM business being in 1985, that being the real decision process. But that really launched that because until that day, we were the afterthought of the company and the microprocessor. We were just this little group of crazy people on the
Exactly.
side. And the technology development guys weren't giving us the time of day in terms of wanting lower resistant polysilicon and 2 levels of metal in those days because we only had 1 level of metal and transistor characteristics. It's like, just take what the memory guys are doing and figure out what you can do with it.
Right.
And that really shifted the attention of the company into a battle that went on for quite some time over resources.
Right. So, but it was a hard transition, but obviously a profitable one.
Yeah.
And from our view in systems group, the memory systems group, and memory components didn't have a big presence in our business. We used memory chips, but that was it. But gee, we thought that MIPO was the center of the universe, and that's where everything flowed from.
We thought so too.
Well, you convinced some of us.
I'd like to close with 2 things here. One, what were, fairly concisely, the lessons learned here?
Well, for me, it was the importance of selling, the importance of marketing. I think David Howe in particular really opened up my mind about marketing and about selling. Obviously, Regis was our god, was the all-knowing person. But Bill, I think, with his experience at selling at HP, as he indicated earlier, about changing the rules of the game, about not playing the other guy's game. If you're not winning in this game, change the game. That was, I'd been an engineer all my life, and this was all new kind of stuff to me, and that just the thinking that went into it, that came out of the committee, to me was transformational.
The other thing I learned, and I think that the company took advantage of, because the whole company learned it, was that you sold the whole system. You sold the whole solution, not only
No stovepipes.
not only the wonderful chip you have, but all the support chips and all the software and all of the example systems and the development systems and all of the FAE support. All of that was part of the solution, and it was a big thing to sell, not just that little chip.
Before that, I remember we would be fighting to get the Salesforce attention from memories, from systems, from single board computers, development systems, the various parts. It was sort of like who can get the Salesforce's attention, and this was just going like from vertical to horizontal in the approach, because now all of a sudden it was a complete sale, a system level sale. It just changed the internal
It became
dynamics.
a
And I
much
said,
easier sell.
Yeah.
Well, I think also.
Because nobody else could do what
Yeah.
Intel had
I
there.
think there was also, maybe let me rephrase this. It seems to me that it was also the customer realization, helped along by Intel, by the way, and by press and so forth, that software upgradability was important, that you couldn't change the architecture every time you came out with a new chip, that there needed to be cohesiveness in that realm. I mean, it wasn't just that Intel said it, it was that the customers got it. Question mark.
Yes, and that's because of the increasing presence of software, where the hardware designs, which used to be the dominant part in cost, now became a smaller portion, and being able to move your software along from generation to generation became more important to protect that value. So I don't know if it was Crush that highlighted that, but certainly the transition of using microprocessors in more software-intensive environments led to that realization.
Note that everyone had, every generation had been incompatible, with the exception of the 85, 80, 85. But with Zilog, with Motorola, with Intel, 68,000. But after that, every system was binary compatible going forward.
Right.
And so it's not something that we had that was unique. We were just like the first people to claim that ground. We said, we are going to be compatible,
Right,
and
right.
all the 8086 software is going to, binaries are going to run directly on the 286 and the 186. Of course, then it was Zilog Motors said, me too, me too.
Right, right.
I think, when you say the customers, but the customers needed educated. And I think this is where the
Yeah.
seminars and the workshop, I mean, it was, I think at one point, somebody said, I don't know, it was or not, that Intel was providing more courses for customers than De Anza had on their yearly schedules. But we got involved in Intel in 1981, so I was there at the very
81?
early.
No, earlier.
1971. I'm sorry.
71, yeah, you
And
were there
so,
when I came.
you know, so the first thing was the 4004, and I have some interesting early meetings about what is a microprocessor, why do we have it, all of those kinds of questions. So it was 10 years in search of a market, but the technology kept moving forward, and I think that it was, and we're talking about Intel being at the time components oriented, but it was all these little operating
Fiefdoms.
groups doing different things, and so we
Fiefdoms.
were kind of torn, doing little piecemeal stuff all over the place. I mean, we were doing stuff, we had Europe, we put an early office up in Portland, and so we were always being torn, just doing things. This brought everything together. This really did, and it sort of was this whole idea that technology and marketing are two sides of the same coin. And Intel recognizing that, I think, was really, really a major achievement, at least from my viewpoint.
Yep. To pile on to that, I discovered that it was the sales guys, it was the field that integrated all of this stuff, because they were the ones that were getting the messages from each of the different product groups, and they had to pull all that stuff together in their head somehow and then present a set of cohesive, which weren't often cohesive messages to the customers. And in this case, the factory, in fact, did get aligned behind that and made that integration and
I
delivery
gave them
easier.
a lot of tools to
Very
do
critical, yeah. But
with the PR and the ad campaigns and the literature campaigns and all of that.
Right. The other thing I'll mention in terms of lessons learned is overwhelming force. If we did all of the same things with Crush, but they were spread out over 2 years instead of concentrated into one, it would not have had the same impact.
They're really into 6 months. I mean, by the second 6 months, we were just in execution mode. The intensity was in December, January, February. By then, we started to get into a rhythm. It was how we were operating, February, March, you know.
The seminar
March,
series
April,
was over by June.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was really 6 months, but 3 months of
Yeah.
unbelievable intensity.
yeah,
It's like advocating for heavy up advertising, right?
well, it was intense.
But the ads went on all year, I think.
Yeah. But I just remember spending sort of my mornings at Intel and my afternoons at Apple. And my evenings
I could ask you which were
writing
more
notes
fun.
and doing work. No. I think this Intel was probably the most fun campaign because, I mean, Apple was
Was doing well.
It was. I always called it a Woodstock. It was a happening. It wasn't a company. Intel was a company. There was an organization and a methodology and a process. Apple wasn't that way.
At another time, I'd like to have a video history of your time at Apple.
Would be good.
I've written
You know
it.
the old joke, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know the old joke about what's the difference between Apple and the Boy Scouts? Boy Scouts have adult supervision.
I think we're wrapping up.
Right, so I guess we'd like to end with a final statement from each one of you relevant to Crush success. Any final comments that you'd like to make?
Well, I guess it was a turning point. It was unbelievable amount of teamwork, intensity brought on by the fact that we believed our corporate life was in danger, and we had to do something. I learned so much dealing with the system side of the house during that time, and Bill David Howe's leadership was impeccable, and the team just pulled behind it. The bureaucrats made everything happen on time and on schedule, and you were a great taskmaster relative to that. Lally was always a fountain of ideas.
Right.
Phenomenal guy to work with. But it's hard to look back and find a better team than we had at that point in time. If you think of the teams you worked with in your career, it's hard to top it.
Yeah.
I would second that 100%. That was, as I said, one of my highlight years in my career, teaching me the marketing profession, at least business-to-business marketing, and witnessing the energy and capability of Intel at the time, all to come together essentially on my behalf.
How old were you at the time?
None of your damn business.
I'm not going to reverse calculate, but I know when we did the 386, one of the things that came out of the 386 oral history, one of the things that came out of it was how incredibly young that team was.
It was a very
I
young
was
team.
37 at the time.
Okay, so you were an older guy.
I was an elder statesman at
Yeah.
Intel.
I was 28.
Yeah, that was.
I was 15.
I was 37 as well.
We're same vintage.
Rich?
So I'll echo this. There's more smart people per cubic meter at Intel than any other company I've ever been at.
At least at that time. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
None of us knows today.
Yeah, but certainly at that time. And but it was usually around the technology and the engineers. So to find this marketing expertise within the company and be able to really see what value marketing could bring to an organization was an amazing experience. That's me. I'm still running a company, and up in Oregon, and what I've been doing is taking notes about the relevance of Crush for the market I'm in today. We've got a new suite of services. We need to be selling to the C-level folks. I'm aware of that. But all of these 9 programs, tools and tech, we just started doing some advertising, sales incentive program. But so where did I learn all that stuff? Here, 30 some odd years ago. And so I need to take it up a notch. I'm talking to myself about that level of intensity and hitting it a little harder. But man, the lessons I've learned at Intel, Crush, and elsewhere are the things that have informed our lives forever. And wonderful stuff.
Regis?
I would just second what everyone else has said. I think the one thing that I would bring up, it was fun. It really was. I mean, you were engaged, but it was, despite the fact that there were a lot of taskmasters, starting with Grove on down, it was absolutely fun. You enjoyed being part of it. You enjoyed the access level that you were able to get any resources or access to anybody who you needed to do whatever you needed to get done. There was no sort of hierarchy you had to go through. I can't tell you the number of times over the years I have used Crush as an example I'm on 6 startup boards. I bring it up, I'll bet, once a week, and still do. I mean, about certainly the intensity level, about the fact that the management has to get involved in the marketing aspects of things, and so much so that I think that this really was a milestone for many things, not only for Intel, but I also think in the world of technology and marketing.
Well, you sit in a position that you could make that judgment probably better than anybody else in the room, in the sense that
You've been involved in so many
Yeah.
great technology companies.
Yeah, but I think that people look to Intel as a great marketing company. I think they do. I mean, not only because of this, but I think this set a precedent. Later on, Intel certainly, went well beyond anything that we had probably imagined.
The first high-tech company to market to end users,
Yeah,
for example.
yeah. So I think that I think it was a unique experience, and I think we all gained an immense amount of value from it for the rest of our careers.
Excellent. Any last comments?
Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for doing
Gentlemen,
this.
thank you for
Yeah,
doing it.
Dane, you
Appreciate it.
did a great job of
Yeah,
pulling this
thank
all
you
together.
both.
Done.
Thank you both.
Very
Yeah.
disparate
Well, Dane,
group.
Rosemary just showed up. Dane did.
No, you